Nathan Harding stood outside the cold, polished glass doors of the Cook County Courthouse, his breath forming little clouds in the crisp Chicago air. His mind raced, but his body felt oddly still, as if the weight of everything pressing down on him had frozen him in place. He couldn't afford to freeze now. Not today. Not after everything that had happened. The Harding family was powerful in Chicago, politically, financially, socially. But none of that mattered today. None of it mattered when it came to him. Nate was just the youngest son, the one who had been ignored, belittled, and cast aside. No one had ever expected him to stand up, to fight for what was his. Hell, no one had even expected him to show up today. Thought you'd chicken out, Laura's voice echoed in his head. His sister, her sharp tone ringing in his memory. She had always known how to twist the knife, how to make him feel small, weak. The worst part, it always worked. He tightened his grip on the worn leather strap of his briefcase. Inside, it contained everything he needed to prove his worth. His mind replayed her words from last night, her laugh, the mockery in her eyes. You've never been good with money, Nate. You'll lose this case just like you've lost everything else. But this wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't about inheritance or the estate. This was about something bigger. Something Nate had never been given the chance to prove. He wasn't just the screw-up son. He wasn't just the family's punching bag. He was about to show them what it meant to underestimate him. Nate stepped inside. The courtroom was silent as he walked in. The air felt thick with tension, heavy with expectations that weren't his own. His family sat in the front row, their cold stares boring into his back. His father's lawyer, Charles McMillan, a man who'd been the family's trusted legal advisor for decades, was standing by the podium. The older man's eyes flicked toward him, then back to the judge, his lip curling in a barely concealed sneer. Nate moved to the podium, every step feeling like a battle. The sound of his shoes on the marble floor echoed louder than he would have liked. All rise, the bailiff called. The judge, a stern figure with graying hair and an air of exhaustion, entered the room. Judge Thompson. His reputation for no-nonsense rulings was well known. He didn't tolerate theatrics, and he didn't care about who you were. That gave Nate a small flicker of hope. Maybe today the rules would finally be fair. Nate stood, shoulders squared, heart hammering in his chest. The court settled. Mr. Harding, you're here to defend yourself in this matter, is that correct? Judge Thompson asked, his voice even uninterested. Nate nodded, trying to steady his nerves. Yes, Your Honor. I am representing myself. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. His family's collective disbelief was almost palpable. I am confident the court will find this case as straightforward, Your Honor, McMillan said, rising to his feet. The family has made every attempt to ensure Mr. Harding's well-being. A settlement has been offered, but as you can see, he refuses to accept it. Nate's family had offered him pennies, literally. It wasn't about money, though. It was about control, about proving that they could make him bow to them, even if it meant stripping him of his dignity. He cleared his throat, the words coming out firmer than he expected. Your Honor, I am not here to negotiate a settlement. I am here to ensure that the assets of my late father's estate are not mishandled, and that my rightful share is preserved. His eyes locked onto McMillan's, challenging him to dismiss him again. McMillan smirked, the arrogance oozing from him. Of course. And how do you plan to accomplish that, Mr. Harding? Without the expertise of a trained attorney. I've done my research, Nate replied, his voice cutting through the room. I've studied the financial records. I know what's been hidden, and I will not let it go unnoticed any longer. The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. You're claiming there's hidden money? In the Harding estate? Nate nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically in offshore accounts and diverted assets that my family has been hiding for years. Gasps filled the room. Nate didn't look at his family. He couldn't. He kept his gaze steady on the judge, feeling his pulse pound in his ears. "We've heard all this before," Macmillan interjected, trying to undermine Nate's claim. "Mr. Harding's accusations are nothing more than a wild theory." Nate took a slow breath, his hands shaking slightly. "I have proof," he said, lifting a folder from his briefcase. "I've come prepared." The judge didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed. Macmillan looked momentarily uneasy. Nate opened the folder and slid the first piece of paper across the table. It was a series of financial records, a trail of wire transfers that led from Harding Enterprises to offshore accounts in the Bahamas. He watched as Macmillan's face shifted from confidence to doubt. "This is a record of $10 million transferred out of the Harding estate to a numbered account that doesn't belong to anyone in the family. These are the transfers that I was not supposed to find," Nate said, his voice low, almost daring anyone to challenge him. The courtroom fell silent. Nate felt his chest tighten with each passing second. "Mr. Harding, this is a serious accusation," the judge said, finally breaking the silence. "Do you understand the implications?" "I do, Your Honor," Nate said, "but I will not sit back and watch my family's legacy be corrupted by greed. This is my fight now, and I will fight to win." Macmillan's face flushed. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain composure. "This is a forgery," he muttered, but even Nate could tell the words lacked conviction. Judge Thompson tapped his gavel. "Mr. Harding, you will need to provide additional evidence before this court can proceed with any further actions. We will reconvene tomorrow morning." Nate nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. As he gathered his papers and walked out of the courtroom, he could feel his family's eyes following him. His father's lawyer, Richard's glare, Laura's silent contempt. But there was something else too, a whisper of something darker, something more dangerous. He could feel it. Someone was watching him. Someone who didn't want him to uncover the truth. Nate's grip on his briefcase tightened. This was only the beginning. End of chapter 1. Nate's hands shook as he sat at the worn wooden table in his family's dining room. The room felt too large, too silent. His father had always preferred grandiose spaces, believing they symbolized power. But now it felt like a prison. The same oppressive silence that had ruled his childhood now pressed down on him. "You're making a huge mistake, Nate." Richard's voice broke the silence. His older brother stood by the window, staring out at the city. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid. "You can't win. Not against Macmillan, not against us. This isn't your fight." Nate didn't look up. He knew Richard's type. All sharp edges, all calculated, always trying to cut others down to make himself feel bigger. "I'm not here for your approval, Richard," Nate said, his voice low. "I'm here to stop what you've done. The money's mine. You can't keep it forever." Laura, standing near the fireplace, snorted. "You think you can just walk in here and fix everything?" she sneered. "Look at you. You've always been the failure. The family screw up." Nate felt it again. The sting of their words, the weight of their scorn. He'd been hearing it for years, but today it felt different. Today he was no longer the weak link. He was the one holding the truth. "Laura, you know as well as I do that this wasn't about the money. This was about control. About lying to our father, lying to me, lying to everyone. You don't get to keep this just because you think you deserve it." Richard turned, his face hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about. Don't make this harder than it already is." But Nate was done listening. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I've seen the evidence. You can't erase the truth." His family was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. But then Charles Macmillan stepped into the room, as calm and calculating as ever. The man had been the family's lawyer for decades. He knew how to play the game better than anyone else. Nate wasn't naive enough to think he was going to back down now. Macmillan didn't greet anyone. He simply walked past Richard and Laura, his eyes never leaving Nate. You've made your move, Nate, but I assure you it's not going to work. You're out of your depth, Macmillan said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. This is how things are done in this family. You should have stayed out of it. I'm not staying out of it, Macmillan, Nate retorted, standing up now. His pulse quickened, the adrenaline pushing his words out faster than he could think. I've found what you were trying to hide, and I'm going to make sure it comes to light. Macmillan smiled, but it was a cold, calculated smile. You think you can take me down? You're just a kid playing at being an adult. You have no idea what you're up against. Nate stepped forward, leaning against the table, his eyes never leaving Macmillan's. I know more than you think. I have everything I need, and you're not going to stop me. Suddenly, the door slammed open. Sarah Moore, the assistant district attorney Nate had been working with, stepped inside. She was short but confident, her demeanor cold but firm. Nate hadn't seen her in a week, but the moment she entered the room, everything felt different. Charles, Sarah's voice was sharp, piercing. I'd like a word with you. Macmillan's face hardened, but he didn't argue. He followed her out of the room, his eyes never leaving Nate's. Nate felt a small shiver of unease. He wasn't entirely sure what Sarah was up to, but he knew she wasn't someone to be underestimated. Nate stayed at the table, trying to steady his breathing. His family's eyes burned into him, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what he was carrying. He couldn't turn back now, not after what he had uncovered. He glanced toward the door where Sarah and Macmillan had just stepped out. His mind raced. There was something about her sudden appearance that didn't sit right with him. Something felt off. As if reading his mind, Laura spoke up. You think Sarah's going to help you? She's in Macmillan's pocket, just like everyone else. Nate turned to face her. You think I don't know that? But I'm not playing their game anymore, and you're going to regret pushing me into this corner. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very air was pressing down on them. His family hadn't expected this. They had always underestimated him. But now, Nate was playing the long game. The twist was coming, and it was coming fast. The moment Sarah stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked it. There was a new message from an encrypted number. She read it quickly. Macmillan isn't the one you should be worried about. There's someone much bigger pulling the strings. Get out before it's too late. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder. Macmillan had disappeared down the hall, and she was left standing alone in the quiet. She couldn't ignore this. But who could she trust now? Nate was already in deeper than he realized. And so was she. The next morning, the courtroom was colder than the day before. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, each beat sinking with the anticipation in the air. His evidence had been laid out before the judge. The file, the accounts, the missing millions. But as the gavel slammed down and the judge called for a recess, Nate's eyes locked on Macmillan, standing at the back, speaking to someone on his phone. The look Macmillan shot Nate could only be described as a promise. The game was only beginning, and Nate was right in the middle of it. End of chapter 2. The rain started in heavy sheets, crashing against the windows of Nate's apartment. The sound was deafening, a constant, drumming reminder of everything that was unraveling. Nate sat in the dim light of his living room, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keys, the tension coiling in his chest as he sifted through the files he had painstakingly gathered. Trust your gut, Sarah had told him earlier that day. When something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. The files were detailed, damning, ledgers, transfer records, emails, and the one piece of information he hadn't anticipated, a set of encrypted messages between Charles Macmillan and an unknown contact. The name of the contact was never mentioned, but the details were unmistakable. There was more to this than just a family inheritance. Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he decrypted the first message. The words flickered onto the screen in fragments. Moving assets, Bahamas, keep it hidden from the board. There was a second message, harder to read. Laura's involved. Must silence the kid. His stomach twisted. His sister? The one person he had always trusted had played him all along. The sound of his phone vibrating on the coffee table broke his concentration. He snatched it up without thinking, his thumb trembling as he swiped the screen. "Sarah, meet me at the usual place," she said, her voice low. "We need to talk." It wasn't a request. It was an order, and Nate knew he had no choice but to obey. The usual place was a dimly lit diner at the edge of the city, an old haunt from his days as a college student. The waitress, a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes, gave him a quick nod as he walked in. Nate didn't bother looking around for Sarah. He knew she'd be at the booth in the far back, near the window where she could watch everything. Always watching. As Nate slid into the booth across from her, Sarah didn't greet him with a smile. She never did. Her sharp eyes were scanning the street, taking in every passerby. She was always on alert. "You've seen the messages, haven't you?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Nate nodded. "Laura's in on it. Macmillan too. They've been hiding money, moving it offshore. And the worst part? They're planning to take me out of the picture." Sarah's face didn't change, but Nate noticed her shoulders tense. "It's bigger than you think. Macmillan isn't just a lawyer. He's a player in something much darker. But you need to be careful. You're getting too close." "Close to what?" Nate leaned forward. "What aren't you telling me?" She met his gaze then, her eyes burning with something Nate hadn't seen before, fear. "The truth. You're digging too deep, Nate. There's a lot more to this than your family's financials. Macmillan's involved in something illegal. Something that could bring down half of the city if it gets out." Nate swallowed. His mind raced. His entire world was spinning out of control. The deeper he went, the more he realized he didn't know. "I don't care about Macmillan," Nate said, his voice tightening. "I care about getting justice. I care about making them pay for what they've done." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. "Justice is a luxury you can't afford right now. You're up against the people who run this city, Nate, and they don't play fair." The diner's door jingled as it opened. Nate's eyes instinctively flicked to it, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the familiar figure standing in the doorway. Richard. He wasn't supposed to be here. Before Nate could say anything, Richard's eyes found his across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just watched. The tension in the air grew thicker as Richard slowly made his way toward the booth. "Don't look at him," Sarah muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "He's here to intimidate you." Richard slid into the booth next to Nate without asking, his presence like a heavy weight pressing down on the table. "You think you're going to win, don't you?" Richard's voice was quiet but cold. "You think you can take everything we've worked for?" Nate didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, but he couldn't afford to lose control. "You've been hiding things from me, Richard," Nate said finally, his voice hardening. "I've seen the records. I know what you've done." Richard didn't flinch. He simply laughed, the sound low and menacing. "You don't know anything, Nate. You never did. This isn't your fight, and it never was." The sudden weight of Richard's words landed on Nate like a hammer blow. His brother wasn't just involved, he was the mastermind. "You really think you can take me down, little brother?" Richard leaned in closer, his breath cold against Nate's ear. "I own you. I always have." "Not anymore," Nate shot back, his voice steady. He wasn't going to let Richard break him. Not this time. Richard's smile disappeared. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I'm going to give you one last chance, Nate. Walk away. If you don't, you won't like what happens next." Nate didn't flinch. "You're not scaring me anymore." Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room felt like it was suffocating. Suddenly, Richard stood up, tossing the envelope onto the table. "You'll regret this," he spat before turning and walking out of the diner, leaving the air heavy with his threat. Nate stared at the envelope, his fingers trembling. He opened it slowly, the tension in the air suffocating. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of Sarah. Nate's pulse spiked. There was a note on the back, scrawled in sharp, unmistakable handwriting. "You're not the only one who's being watched." Nate's blood ran cold. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone bigger. Someone Nate couldn't see yet. End of chapter 3. The rain hadn't stopped since the night before, a constant downpour that seemed to match the growing storm inside Nate's head. He hadn't slept a wink. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Richard's face, of Sarah's warnings flooded his mind. The truth was out there, somewhere. But every time he thought he was getting closer to it, the ground seemed to shift under his feet. The clock on the wall read 6 a.m., but it felt like the middle of the night. The shadows were deep in the corners of his apartment. The stillness was almost suffocating. Nate's phone buzzed, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was Sarah. "Meet me at the office." Now, her message said blunt and urgent. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and left, stepping into the damp streets of Chicago. The city felt different this morning, darker, colder. Something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him, that eyes were on him, watching his every move. Sarah was waiting in the lobby of her building, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't acknowledge Nate's presence when he stepped off the elevator. She simply led him down a sterile corridor to a small conference room. "Sit," she said sharply, her voice tight with something Nate couldn't quite place. Nate followed her orders, settling into the chair across from her. The room was bare, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Everything felt off, like a trap waiting to snap shut. "I found something," Sarah began, her eyes meeting his. "Something big." Nate's pulse quickened. "What is it?" She slid a folder across the table toward him. Inside were several more decrypted messages, and at the top was a name, Carter Avery. "Who's Carter Avery?" Nate asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Sarah's expression hardened. "Avery is the CEO of Intertech Solutions. He's not just some tech mogul. He's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes." Nate frowned. "You're telling me Avery is involved in this?" She nodded. "Macmillan is working for him. All of this, the offshore accounts, the illegal transfers, it's all connected to him. But Avery isn't just involved in business deals. He's got his hands in much darker things. And Richard, he's caught in the middle of it." Nate's mind raced. Everything he thought he knew about this situation was starting to crumble. Avery's name meant power, influence. If Macmillan and his family were entangled with him, then this wasn't just about money. It was about something much bigger. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Nate's voice was low, tense. "I didn't have the full picture until now. We've been getting closer to the truth." But Sarah hesitated. She looked around, checking the hallway before continuing. "Someone doesn't want us to find out. Someone is trying to stop us, and they're willing to do anything to keep their secret safe." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Nate's heart skipped a beat. "Sarah, what are you saying?" He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you telling me someone's trying to kill me?" She met his gaze, her face pale. "I'm saying you're not the only one in danger. Someone's already tried to sabotage our investigation. I'm trying to protect you, but I need you to trust me. There are eyes everywhere. They're watching us." Nate felt the weight of her words sink in. He was in over his head, and now there was no way out. The sound of a car, door slamming, outside, broke the silence. Sarah's phone buzzed again, and this time her face went pale. "They know," she whispered, grabbing the folder and shoving it into her bag. Nate stood, his heart pounding. "Who knows?" "It doesn't matter. We need to get out of here. Now." Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. Nate hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He looked out the window, his eyes scanning the street below. The rain was still coming down, but now there were figures moving beneath the cover of the building's awning. "Who are they?" Nate asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But we need to go. Now." They moved quickly, making their way through the halls and down to the back exit. As they stepped out into the alley, Nate's instincts kicked in. He glanced around, scanning the shadows. He wasn't sure if it was the rain or the adrenaline, but everything felt heightened. He could hear his own breath, sharp and loud in his ears. And then he saw it, two figures standing at the far end of the alley, half hidden in the mist. They weren't moving. They were waiting. "We need to go the other way," Sarah said, her grip tightening on his arm. But it was too late. The figures stepped forward, revealing themselves. It was Richard, and standing next to him, grinning in the shadows, was Charles McMillan. "I told you, Nate," Richard's voice was cold, cutting through the rain. "You should have stayed out of this. Now you've made it personal." McMillan stepped into the light, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's too late for you now, Nate. There's no turning back." Nate's pulse spiked. This was it. The trap was closing in, and they were the ones who had set it. "Sarah," Nate said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "You were right. There's no going back now." The figures moved closer, the air growing thicker, suffocating. Nate's mind raced. The walls were closing in. There was no escape. End of chapter 4. The alley was cold, the damp air biting at Nate's skin as he stood, frozen, facing Richard and McMillan. The sound of the rain pounding against the pavement was deafening, but all Nate could hear was the thundering pulse in his own ears. Sarah was beside him, but she was already stepping back, eyes darting around looking for an escape. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Richard's smile was cruel, a thin line of victory stretching across his face. "You've pushed too far, Nate," he said, his voice cold. "There's no way out of this now." McMillan stood beside Richard, arms crossed, watching Nate with an unsettling calm. "It's over." "You should have known your place," he added, his voice smooth like silk, but with the weight of finality. Nate felt his heart race. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't just about his family. This was a game of power, and he was on the losing side. But there was one thing Richard hadn't counted on. Nate wasn't going to bend. Not this time. "Not yet," Nate said, his voice steady, though his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but he knew he couldn't back down. Richard laughed, the sound echoing off the walls of the alley. "You think you can stop this? You think you have anything left? You're nothing. You've always been nothing." Nate's jaw tightened. He couldn't let his brother get to him. Not now. "You're wrong," Nate said, taking a step forward, his gaze locked on Richard. "I'm not done, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." Richard's eyes darkened. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his breath hot against Nate's face. "You think this is just about me, don't you? You think I'm the only one pulling the strings? You're in way over your head, Nate. I'm not the real problem here." Nate's heart skipped a beat. He didn't understand. What was Richard talking about? McMillan spoke then, his voice quiet but filled with menace. "There's a lot more at stake here than just your family's empire. You're playing with fire, Nate. And when it burns, it won't just be you getting burned." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Nate's mind raced. This wasn't just about his father's money or his family's wealth. It was something bigger, something far darker. He had been too focused on the surface, on the inheritance, on the betrayal. But there was something else at play here, something much more dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nate said, though his voice was trembling now. Fear was creeping in, but he wasn't going to show it. Richard's smile only grew wider. "You will, but by then it'll be too late." Nate felt a chill wash over him, like a shadow passing over his soul. What had he gotten himself into? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Nate, we need to go. Now. She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from Richard and Macmillan. They turned and started walking briskly down the alley, away from the men who were so sure they had won. But Nate couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the worst yet. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Nate's stomach churned. Sarah, he whispered, his voice low but urgent. What did Richard mean? Who else is involved? Sarah's pace slowed, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, her eyes scanning their surroundings. We don't have time for that now. But I'll tell you this. There's more to this than just family drama. Richard, Macmillan, Avery, they're all connected. And they've been hiding something much worse than you realize. Nate's breath hitched. Avery, he repeated. He had heard that name before, in the files Sarah had shown him, but he hadn't fully understood who Avery was. He's not just a business mogul, Sarah explained, her voice tight. He's connected to some very dangerous people. People who don't play by the rules. And they'll do anything to protect their secrets. Nate's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make a picture he liked. What does this mean for me? What am I supposed to do? You need to get ahead of this, Nate, Sarah said. Find out everything you can. You're not just fighting your family anymore. You're fighting a whole network of corruption. And they don't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Nate stopped walking, his mind spinning. This is bigger than I thought. How did I get here? Because you're the only one who can stop it, Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction. They underestimated you. They think you're just the family screw-up. But you've got more to you than they realize. A chill ran down Nate's spine. He wasn't just fighting for his inheritance anymore. He was fighting for his life. They reached the car, and as Sarah drove, the tension in the air thickened. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced someone was following them. The streets of Chicago blurred past them, dark and empty under the rain. Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face pale. She didn't say anything, but Nate could see the tension in her shoulders. We're not alone, she muttered. We need to move. Who is it? Nate asked, his voice tight with panic. But Sarah didn't answer. She just slammed her foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life as they sped away. Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he looked over his shoulder. In the distance, a black SUV pulled into view. It was tailing them. Hold on, Sarah said. This is about to get worse. End of chapter 5. The city of Chicago sprawled beneath Nate, a labyrinth of lights and shadows. From the roof of his apartment building, the distant hum of the city felt like the world itself holding its breath. He stood alone, staring out over the skyline, knowing this was the moment everything had been building to. A deal had been struck, not the one he thought he'd be making with his family, but the one he was forced into to survive. The SUV had followed them, but now it was parked across the street, stationary. Nate had no illusions left. He was being watched. Sarah, too, had disappeared into the shadows, not trusting the walls of her apartment anymore. The weight of what they'd uncovered wasn't something they could simply walk away from. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence, but he didn't answer it. The message from Sarah flashed on the screen. We're running out of time. Nate closed his eyes for a moment. How had things escalated so quickly? What was once just a battle for family control, for the money that was rightfully his, had turned into something darker. Much darker. The black SUV wasn't empty. Inside, 2 men sat in the front. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses, even at night. The other, smaller, was looking at a tablet, swiping through pages of information. Files Nate had seen himself only hours earlier. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him to slip. Nate had already made his decision. He wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. Not by his family, not by Macmillan, and not by these faceless men who lurked in the shadows. The truth will always find its way out, even if you have to tear everything apart to make it happen. The words echoed in his mind as he took a long, steadying breath. He could feel the adrenaline starting to kick in again, the rush of fear and the urgency that came with it. But it wasn't fear that guided him now. It was something sharper, something colder. The truth. The truth was his weapon, his shield. He turned away from the rooftop and made his way downstairs, each step heavy with the realization that he had no choice. This wasn't about winning a case anymore. It was about survival. As he stepped into the lobby, he passed a security guard who barely looked up. The elevator pinged, and he stepped inside. As the doors closed, Nate felt his phone buzz once more. This time he answered it. "Sarah." His voice was tight but steady. "Meet me at the old office," she said quickly. "I've got it all. The final piece. But we're not alone." The words sent a chill down Nate's spine. "What do you mean?" "I'm sending the address." "You need to hurry," she said, her voice crackling with urgency. The line went dead. Nate didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket, his pulse pounding, and made his way to the address Sarah had sent him. This was the endgame. No more waiting, no more secrets. This would end tonight. The office was a ghost of its former self. Empty files, broken furniture, and dust in the corners. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held a small, unmarked envelope. "You were right," she said as Nate entered, her voice low. "Everything we've found, it's worse than we thought. Macmillan, Richard, they've been playing us. They've been playing you from the start." Nate didn't need to hear more. He stepped toward her, his eyes already scanning the contents of the envelope. Inside there were bank statements, wire transfers, and one final document that made Nate's heart stop. A confession, signed by Richard and Macmillan. They were tied to the laundering of millions, siphoned through offshore accounts, but the kicker? The name of the politician at the top of it all. Someone who had orchestrated the entire scheme. It was his father's old colleague, a man Nate had once trusted. A crash echoed through the office. The door splintered, and 3 men in suits rushed in, their faces masked with cold professionalism. The leader of the group stepped forward, tall, with sharp features, a man who radiated authority. "You shouldn't have come, Nate," he said, his voice a mix of pity and threat. "This isn't your fight." Nate didn't flinch. "It is now," he said, his voice low and unyielding. The weight of the files in his hand felt like a shield. "You think this ends with you?" the man said, smirking. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us." But Nate wasn't listening anymore. He was done with their games. The years of manipulation. The lies. He knew what he had to do now. The truth always comes at a cost. He pulled the files out, slammed them on the table, and the words spilled out like a bomb. "I'm calling the authorities. This ends now," Nate said, his voice ice cold. "I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." The man's smirk faltered. "You won't get away with this." "I already have," Nate shot back, turning his back and walking toward the door. A few hours later, the authorities had arrived. Richard, Macmillan, and their accomplices were taken away in handcuffs. The political connections, the corrupt dealings, the money, they were all exposed. Nate stood outside, staring at the wreckage of what had been his life. The city that had once seemed so daunting now felt different. It felt like his to conquer. But this wasn't about power. Not anymore. It was about reclaiming his life from the people who had tried to tear it apart. As the sun began to rise over the city, Nate felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The battle was over. The truth had won. He had fought for what was rightfully his, and in the process he had become something greater, something stronger. In the end, it wasn't about money or power. It was about justice. Because sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight for ourselves. End of chapter 6.